Returning to our top story, the clock is ticking for Malaysia's frontrunners to tell the king how they intend to form the next government. They must state their alliances and nomination for Prime Minister by 2 p.m. local time today.
Two former allies are gunning to be the next premier. Former Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin and opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim. Mr. Muhyiddin claims he has the numbers and statutory declarations to convince the king he can be prime minister again with his Perkitan Nasional alliance. The opposition chief, who leads the Pakatan Harapan coalition, claims that he too has the numbers backing him.
For more insight, Tricia Yeoh, CEO of the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, joins us from Kuala Lumpur. Tricia, the king had asked for the coalitions with the most seats to submit their statutory declarations and prime ministerial nominations by 2 p.m. today. What's your read on who has the numbers?
Hi, good morning. So I think it's been an exciting time for us here in Malaysia. And yes, exactly 2 p.m. today is the deadline. So what we have are essentially Perkitan Nasional, led by Muhyiddin, and of course Pakatan Harapan, led by Anwar Ibrahim. And both are stating that they have the support of Barisan Nasional in the middle that has about 30 seats to offer either of these other two coalitions. At the moment, I know that it's anyone's prediction really, but from what we're seeing, the fact that GPS in Sarawak and GRS in Sabah yesterday had press conference and have already talked about Muhyiddin Yassin as their prime minister-elect. So that seems to indicate to me that Muhyiddin at the moment has the upper hand. If, of course, Barisan Nasional today and this morning itself, they are meeting with Pakatan Harapan. If Barisan Nasional decides to go with Pakatan Harapan, it's still a little bit suspicious just because the numbers may not necessarily make up. Essentially, you do need a GPS by your side to be able to have a secure majority, at least one that is not going to be as shaky and unstable as we've seen in the last 4 years. We've had 3 prime ministers in the last 4 years. And so what we also want to see is ideally a slightly more stable majority that can steer the country out of the various economic instabilities that we might also foresee in 2023.
So Sarawak's GPS has announced that the coalition has agreed to be part of PN and BN. And yesterday, you called for smaller parties who are in a position of strength right now to exercise wisdom as they wield their power. How confident are you that negotiations have been based on policy rather than patronage or money politics?
Yes, so Ideas issued a statement yesterday actually calling exactly for that we hope that negotiations are based on policy and not on patronage, money politics, concessions, buying of positions, distribution of positions. I think at the moment it's quite unrealistic to imagine that the leaders are sitting around the table and negotiating based on which forms of legislations and policies are going to be the best outcomes for Malaysia. Unfortunately, because of the way the political system works in the country, the patronage system is still very much at large. And I imagine that the negotiations are not currently just based on the position of who the prime minister is going to be, number one, but it's also based on who the deputy prime minister would be, as well as the various cabinet minister positions that are given out. So, how many positions are going to be given to Sarawak in GPS, how many positions are going to be given to GRS in Sabah, so on and so forth. So it's not just cabinet positions, but also the heads of government-linked companies. We have very many of those in Malaysia, statutory bodies, and so on.
Well, Pakatan Harapan won the most seats in GE15. Why are they struggling to find coalition partners? And do you think Anwar Ibrahim is going to come up short yet again?
So I think there are some constitutional lawyers and people looking at conventions from around the world who are trying to make that argument, right? That precisely with Pakatan Harapan winning 82 seats of the 222 is the largest single bloc, should actually be given the opportunity and the first bite of the cherry, so to speak, by the king to be invited and form a government. But I think, there are also various conventions around the world. And if the other parties can combine and show that they have a majority, that may be convincing and persuasive. The Constitution is actually quite silent on these matters. The Agong just needs to be persuaded that there is an MP that commands the majority of Parliament. The question about whether Anwar himself will be able to eventually take Prime Minister position. I mean, he's been fighting for this for 30 years now. It really is premised on GPS position, whether they are willing to work with him as a Prime Minister, number one. Number two, willing to work with Pakatan Harapan as a coalition, because don't forget that the component parties, DAP and PKR, are parties that actually do compete within East Malaysia. So come state elections, whether that's something that they can contend with. DAP especially is, trying to gain more seats in Sarawak, and GPS is very conscious and aware of that. And the third big factor, of course, is that GPS has always been familiar with working with a coalition like Barisan Nasional, which Perkitan Nasional is actually the closest to in form and structure, nature, and so on.
Very quickly before we go, the right-wing Islamist Party of Malaysia, PAS, rose quietly during this election. It has a hardline Islamist agenda. What does their increasing traction indicate about where Malaysian politics is headed?
Yeah, so I think just to give an indication to the listeners, Perkitan Nasional, Muhyiddin's bloc had 73 seats, and of which 49 are actually, which is the majority, right? Over 60% are taken by PAS, the Islamic Party. What does this indicate? I think, firstly, I know that the very first take and the generalization that people might make is that Malaysia is becoming a more conservative, Islamic traditional society. I think that may be true, but one must also be quite circumspect and careful about the analysis here, because one of the reasons that many people may have flocked to PAS or Perikatan Nasional, PAS in this instance, was precisely because there is a large chunk of Malaysia that is Malay conservative that could not bring themselves to vote for UMNO in this election. UMNO has been struck and has been struggling with issues of corruption over already the last 5 to 10 years. But not just that, they were split down the middle by leadership struggles, very unlike UMNO of the past. So I think it was just too much for them to bring themselves to vote UMNO, and PAS was seen as the non-corrupt, clean alternative with not so much baggage. And so that's one of the reasons I think they chose PAS. But the question about whether we're seeing a rising conservatism in the country, that is possibly true among the younger voters. We've seen polls in the past that indicate they are more likely to identify themselves as Muslim first as opposed to Malay first. And of course, being Malaysian itself, a distant third. But I think one should also not make the mistake of thinking that these are necessarily on the fringes of the most extreme type conservatives. I think the large majority of Malaysia is still what we would call perhaps traditional rather than conservative. They do adhere to these traditional values. And unfortunately, the perception of DAP that has been put forward to them for politically expedient reasons is that DAP and therefore an extension Pakatan Harapan is unable to support those kinds of traditionalist values. DAP is painted as this ultra-liberal party that no Malay party should want to work with. So these kinds of polarizing trends are unhealthy for a country that is multiracial and multi-religious. But I think we do need to be careful about just having these sweeping generalizations before we get to know the details and doing greater research on the ground.
Yes, very well put. Thanks very much for your thoughts this morning. Tricia Yeoh, the CEO of the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs. Thank you for joining us.